Welcome, everyone. Today we're having a conversation with Hadley Wickham, Chief Scientist at Posit, the company behind our studio. Hadley's the author or co-author of several books, and hopefully I will remember to list all of them this time. So we have R for Data Science, which of course the community is named after, with Garrett Grohlman, and now being joined by Mina Chetnkaya-Rundell for the second edition. And there it is.
Does exist in physical form now. So.
Excellent. I hadn't checked the dates on that one. ggplot2, elegant graphics for data analysis, being joined by Danielle Navarro and Thomas Lynn Peterson for the third edition. R packages with Jenny Bryan, which I have pre-ordered that one. I know that one's coming very soon for the second edition. And then the two books that, at least theoretically, we are focusing more on today, Advanced R, which had the second edition a few years ago, and Mastering Shiny. And he also has a book of cocktail recipes, but I think that one's harder to buy these days. So I think that was everything. Oh, yeah, there you go. And of course, he also leads the tidyverse and rlib open source dev teams and contributes to a wide array of packages. So thank you for joining us, Hadley.
You're welcome.
All right. So I want to start by getting the elephant in the room out of the way. What can you tell us about the recent activities at Posit, and specifically, how do you think it might impact our package development and our Studio IDE?
Do you mean, are you talking about the layoffs?
I do, yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you've probably seen, but people looking for jobs, we had to do layoffs at Posit across the whole company. So we laid off about 10% of a little under 10% of our employees. And basically for all the reasons that companies normally do layoffs, which is our expenses were higher than our income, fortunately. So, we tried everything we could to avoid that, but unfortunately had to let some really awesome people go. So hopefully our loss will be someone else's gain. That these people were, everyone we were super sad to lose, and I'm confident they'll be awesome employees at other companies.
Okay. All right, and now I set up some tags on the questions we have. It's being posted in the chat from time to time. We have a Slido board where you can ask questions, and I am trying to keep track of them, but there might be more coming in, so let me know. Well, hopefully I'll find them all. All right, so our first section of questions are all focused around metaprogramming. So we had a question from Colin about where the term data masking came from. He says, it seems more like it's environment masking, and the latest cohort of Advanced R was a little confused by that choice of wording in the book. So any thoughts on that?
I guess it depends on whether you think about like what is being masked versus what is doing the masking. So I'd say data masking because it's data that's masking things that are in the environment.
That makes sense.
Trying to think if I remember anything else we talked about.
Where it came from.
Yeah, so I don't think there's much, it's obviously a technique that's used in quite a few places in base R, but I don't think it has a consistent name there. So I think we just call it data masking because you've got a data frame that's going to mask variables in the environment.
Okay. All right, next up in that same vein is we had a question from Arthur about tidyverse, metaprogramming, closures, data masking. There's a lot of jargon for would-be developers building on top of the tidyverse.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or plans about is there any more simplification? Like, the Embrace came in and made things a little simpler. Is there any more that you're working on, or is that just, that's just the way it is at this point?
I don't think so. I mean, there's always a possibility at some point in the future we'll realize, oh, we could have made it, we can make it much simpler by doing this. But I'd say that's not something we're like actively thinking about at the moment, because we do believe it's pretty simple now, especially with embracing, and since in most cases you don't need to know like what quasi quotation is and unquoting and all that kind of stuff. It's always, I think it's always tough when we always think about this a lot when we think about introducing like new vocabulary, like is it going to be worth it?
Right.
And I think for like tidy eval in particular, we've tended to err, I think, more on the side of creating new vocab so it can be more precise about it. So it does there is kind of more of a burden when you start learning it, but that hopefully kind of pays off because it forces you, like you have to think about these things that you've never thought about before. And it's really hard to think about things that you don't have like some name, some word to hang that idea across in your brain. So I think like, I don't know, I'd say I don't think we've introduced like more jargon than we need. It's like more that we've introduced these like new concepts and then we had to give them names.
Right.
Maybe we'll come up with fewer concepts in the future, but it feels like pretty minimal to me right now. Although, of course, like at every point, it's always felt the most minimal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have introduced it to the community.
Fair enough. So on those lines, or along those lines again, we have a question from Colin and then another one from Arthur that's related about, are there any additional resources you would recommend to learn more about metaprogramming in R? Or Arthur pointed out or asked, is there any plans for a spiritual successor to the Tidy Eval book? The R-lang and vignettes are good, but an R-lang cookbook could be better. For example, cases for when you might still want to use end quote.
Yeah, I think like I would say the places that I would start now, I think the place that's like the best place if you want to get started is the functions chapter in the second edition of R4Data Science. That certainly gives you like the data frame functions section in particular gives you what I think is now like the minimal kind of motivation for tidy eval and introduction to it. I think once you get beyond that layer and want to go deeper, then like advanced R is like probably your best option, which unfortunately means you now have to like go much deeper and think more about the kind of underlying data structures and stuff. But I think like it's hard for me to see what would go in the middle. Like I think we've solved like all of the most common cases that would go in like a recipe book. I think we've like covered. Also, I think the dplyr programming vignette has quite a few recipes as well. So if you like want to go beyond that, like you're going to have to start inventing it yourself, and to do that, you're going to need to learn a bit more about the lower lying tools, unfortunately.
Okay. So I guess next we have another question from Colin because he put a bunch in here. So where does the vectors package fit within the R landscape? R landscape. What problem is it attempting to solve?
I would say it's mostly about bringing consistency to tidyverse packages so that when you're combining two vectors of different types, regardless of which package you're using, you get the same logic. And then our hope is that consistency, even if you never learn about the theory, you can build your own, it's easier to build your own internal mental model for what's going on to make more accurate predictions in the future. It's, I don't know, I think some of, like vectors is one of these packages where kind of our core has responded to it to some extent, so that in some of the major motivating reasons we created it, like less important now, like that now you can actually concatenate two factors together in a useful way, like stuff like that. I still think like the kind of like the theoretical underpinning of vectors is much cleaner. And it makes it easier to do sort of a smaller set of key operations that you just need to implement. And once you've implemented that, you get everything else built on top of it. It's also, I don't know, I think some of what we've learned about vectors is it will also end up in, or has ended up, or will end up in the S7 package. And we will need to kind of rethink some of what vectors does as part of that. Because vectors does implement its own kind of dispatch mechanism in order to work the way that we want. And I suspect we could probably use S7 for that now, possibly. Or
Well,
think about that.
That is a perfect transition, because the next question is like, what are the plans for S7 in the future? Like, how active is that development, and where will it fit into, you know, the ecosystem of the various OOP systems?
Yeah, so I think it reminds me that I just really need to put that on my to-do list. I think we're like very close to a CRAN release. It's just a matter of like kicking it over, just, you know, just doing the release process to get it working. And then thinking, I don't know, I need to remember how much like it uses some, like we got some patches into R4.3 to make it work better. And I just need to recall or do some work to think about, like, is there additional stuff you want to, if you want to use S7 in a package that you want to work on earlier versions of R, what do you need to do? But I think S7, I think it's like certainly a replacement for S3. Like there's absolutely no reason not to use it. Compared to S3, like it has nicer syntax. I think it's better documented. It fixes a bunch of weird and annoying edge cases in S3. And then I think even S4, it fills in enough of the gaps in S3 that S4 was created to fill in, but it does so in a much simpler way that I think is easier for most people to understand. That I think it's superior to S4 as well. So I think it's still, it's not even on CRAN yet,
Right.
but it feels like pretty solid to me. Like I think the fact that we had folks from R-core and Bioconductor and tidyverse and r/OpenSci and other folks in the wider R community kind of thinking and commenting on it, that it's a really, I think, strong design and it fixes the problems that we wanted to fix.
Great.
Now it's still, the same style of OO programming as S3 and S4, like the generic function style. It doesn't, sort of complementary to R6 in many ways. And I should say that one of the reasons we were originally talking about, originally this package is called R7, and we decided to change the name because it seemed like a successor to R6. Which it is not. So we stuck with S7, even though it is not completely unrelated to the S programming language, but it's like, it is, I think, the best parts of S3 and S4.
Oh.
So I think once that package is on CRAN, like we need, like in the tidyverse, we'll start experimenting with using it various places. Typically that will start on kind of packages that are on like the edge of the ecosystem, rather than like packages that are at the very core that flow out to everything. But it's, I don't know, I find it like, I kind of dip back into S7 every now and then. Obviously, I have nowhere near as much experience using it as S3, but I find it much easier to remember how it works. And the way you define classes and methods, I think, is much more straightforward and obvious to newer folks.
So is the plan still for that to eventually like become part of R, or do you think it'll always be a package?
Yeah, I think that's still the plan. Obviously, like the next step is to get it onto CRAN and get it get more experience with people using it. I think it's easy to like miss the fundamental disadvantages of having a package like embedded in R itself, which is now that you can only update that package every time R updates. Right. So it's a much slower release cycle, and you're tied in with all this other stuff. So we want to get this package as like solid as possible before we get it into base R. There's also some like open questions, like this is a package that like we have developed it so that like when you're using the package, it doesn't have there's very few dependencies. But like when you're developing the package, it still uses Roxygen and test that and all of the kind of developer tooling that we are used to and would find it hard to live without. But there's sort of open questions about like what is that? Like what does that mean if this gets incorporated as a base R? Like, does that mean it has to come off GitHub and go into SVN and all this other kind of stuff, which will take some time to resolve?
All right, that's good to know. And then I've got, I think, one more in kind of this advanced R side of the world, and then I'm going to switch over to some Shiny specific things for a bit, and then we'll see where we go from there. So I guess tangentially, the advanced R side of the world, is the Tidyverse design guide book like ready for readers? And if yes, are developers outside Posit supposed to be part of the audience of that?
I would say some chapters are. And yeah, the goal is to turn this into a book that that's accessible to anyone in the R community, and that is the next book I'm going to be working on. So hopefully there'll be some updates to that.
Strongly along those lines, would comments be helpful, useful?
I think so. If it's on a chapter that looks like there's no point in commenting on a chapter that's like clearly unfinished to complain about the grammar or the reasoning or the logic. If the chapter does seem to be pretty complete, then I think comments of that nature are useful. And also at some point I will be like start polling for like examples and like, give me your design conundrum so I can like analyze them and either answer them with links to things in the book or, write new stuff.
Will you be putting those polls out on Mastodon or,
I do not. Definitely won't be on Twitter, but it's hardly anyone on Mastodon. So I don't know. I think I might try. I think this book might be kind of a good fit for Substack or something where I kind of syndicate, the chapters every couple of weeks. So I might experiment with that because I think that's just a good way. Like, because you don't like this is not going to be a book by and large that you're going to want to read from start to finish. Right. But it'd be something where it's useful to kind of get this drip feeding into your brain every now and then, and do some. It's going to be a lot more kind of discussion and talking with other developers about their thoughts and stuff. So hopefully it's a little, it's going to be heavily motivated by our experiences designing packages in the Tidyverse and RLib. It's not really about the Tidyverse, and hopefully we can hopefully I can figure out how to include some of the stuff where there's like genuine differences of opinion on folks on my team and folks outside the team. So there's a bit more of a like, there are very few places where there's like one correct answer. This is more about like how do you analyze the trade-offs, how you're aware of the different options, and how do you fit between.
Great. So to wrap up on that thought, how do the Tidyverse style guide and like the new Tidy Team code review principles book fit in? Are those more aimed in internal, or also do you think those are useful outside of the team?
I think they're quite useful outside of the team, and we've really written them mostly for people outside. Like the Tidyverse style guide, I think is sort of one now one of the few like style guides out there you can choose to follow. Particularly once like Google uses the tidyverse style guide now, which is pretty nice selling point. Yeah, and then the what do we call it? The pull request guide.
Like the code review
code
principles.
review guide. Yeah, that's like some of that was written for us to force us to kind of codify our principles. Quite a lot of it is written just so that when people ask the same question again and again, we can just link to something rather than writing it. And then some of it is just the hope that people will base their own work on this as well. Though certainly we have different because we maintain so many packages and have hundreds of potential contributors. It's a bit different to most packages.
All right. So switching over to Shiny for at least a little bit. First question I have here is, if you were to write a new edition of Mastering Shiny right now, what new things or chapters would you include, if anything?
That's a good question. And I have to say, like, Mastering Shiny is the book that is like least loaded in my head. And I find Mastering Shiny particularly useful because when I have to go write Shiny apps, I can read what I wrote and remember it. I think the stuff that's sort of changing at the moment that isn't really reflected in Mastering Shiny is the kind of the UI side of things. I think that's still my sense from conversations with the Shiny team, that it's still kind of in flux to some extent, and they're still sort of thinking about how can we kind of visually refresh the design of Shiny apps in general. How can we make it easier to like bundle various more complex components? So I don't know if there's anything I would specifically update now, but certainly the stuff coming in the future. I think there's been some changes, like testing as well. It's probably worth documenting, although the way that I think you should test Shiny apps is not the way that Shiny team recommends you test Shiny apps. So it's a little different there. Anyway, I think those are the main things. Obviously, the big things that the Shiny team have been working on lately is Shiny for Python, and then the Shiny visual editor. And the visual editor, that's probably worth some discussion in the book, but I don't know, it's not a tool that the goal of the tool is to avoid having to use a bunch of extensive documentation. You can just like drag and drop to use it. So that certainly get mentioned in the book. And then, obviously Shiny for Python will need its own book at some point.
That is anticipating the next question of has Joe Cheng convinced you to write a Shiny for Python book yet?
He has. No, I think I have I think I've kind of like begrudgingly offered that if they can't find anyone else to do it, I would probably write it for them. But I don't really want to have to learn Python, and I think we worry a little bit that if I wrote like a Mastering Shiny for Python, then people would like freak out and be like, "Oh my God, Hadley hates R. He's just using Python now. It's the end of the world." So probably not get it. I hope it's not me. But I think we'll probably find someone.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that reaction. Let's see, and I guess in that same vein, has there been a surge in the Shiny user base due to the support for Shiny for Python, and I guess RStudio more widely supporting more of Python generally?
I wouldn't say a surge. I'd say we're like seeing slow growth. I think it's much easier for us to introduce new stuff in the R community because people know who RStudio /posit is, and when we release something, like people like try it out regardless of its merits and to some extent, like like we've already built up enough goodwill in the R community that folks are willing to kind of take, when we say something is important and useful, people are willing to take us on our word, and that's not the case in the Python community. We're still relative newcomers, and on top of that, there's just much bigger competition in the Python space, like Streamlit and Dash, and Streamlit got bought by Snowflake for like $800 million. So there's just these very these popular frameworks with a lot of money behind them already, and we are trying to figure out like how do we help Python people realize, like, understand like why Shiny is a good framework and they might want to try it. And I think there's kind of an interesting tension, because I think Streamlit is and probably will always be easier to get started with than Shiny for Python, because it's a fundamentally simple model. So if you just want to slap something together really quickly, it's always going to be easier to use Streamlit to do that, because it just has this very simple model where it just runs from the top of your script to the bottom of your script. Like you can understand that with like that description, like understanding how the reactive graph works is, that's a much bigger job. But obviously, like running from top to bottom is not going to work for every script. So like as you start to get into more complicated apps, I think we firmly believe like you have to have something like this reactive graph model. And so like how do we present that? Like how do you kind of show people like, hey, yeah, Streamlit, like it's great, it's really easy to get up and running with, but you're eventually gonna hit this brick wall of complexity where your app just becomes fiendishly more complicated, and it's very difficult to understand like where are the performance bottlenecks and what how do you fix them.
That makes sense. Back in the R Shiny world, do you have any advice on how to continue to become an advanced Shiny developer after mastering Shiny? Do you have any other books you would recommend, documentation, exercises, anything along those lines?
I don't think there's any like, I think there's like, one way to continue is to get more into the HTML, JavaScript, CSS side. Like if you really want to dive into the UI development, I think that's like one obvious place to go. And there are a couple of good books. I forget what they're called, but I think there's one by David Grandjohn and another by David Cohen. John Cohen.
Yeah.
John Cohen, about like how do you like learn these skills to create these really advanced UI. But I think the other way is to just like, I think the other skill set is just the sort of general programming, software engineering skill set of like, how do I break down this complex problem into, simple pieces that I can understand in isolation. And some of that is like using Shiny modules, but some of that is just like writing functions, and some of that is like putting everything into a package and like testing them so that you can like make sure all of these pieces work well in isolation. So obviously I spend most of my life inside R packages, so I kind of see everything through that lens. But like certainly it's not hard to start with a package. You just put just put your R scripts in the R directory, and then you get all these tools for free around unit testing and tools for loading all your code. And I think that is going to be what sort of pays off. Like think, how do you make sure the complexity of your app kind of grows either linearly or maybe even less than linearly as the size of your app grows, rather than growing like quadratically or worse, which is quite possible to do if you have every single component interacting with every other component. So I think those are the skills that you need that really help you as a Shiny app developer. I don't know how you learn those skills, except to like do it and try things out and fail a few times. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So our packages 2E comes out in, I think, end of July. R for data science 2E, I'm not sure. Is that, I'm not sure the timeline on that.
I mean, I have the physical. I mean,
yeah,
you didn't join us. I have a physical copy. So physical copies do exist in the world, which I think means that. I was actually just going to look at this on Amazon to see.
Yeah, I was trying to pull that up. It looks like it is available to order. Oh, that's in like 3 weeks, a little under 3 weeks. So
yeah, so July 18th.
I've already pre-ordered this, so yeah.
Oh, it's like,
all right.
Well, actually, it says I can have it delivered between the 6th and the 8th.
It said that earlier for me for our packages as well. So it's interesting. I think they're having issues with their release date system.
Yeah, so I think technically also our packages, like we finished that like slightly before after data science, like a day or two before. So that should be like very close. They should both be coming out very close to the same time.
Excellent. So that leads me to, what is the status of the other in-flight books? I guess starting with ggplot 2 3rd edition. How do you feel about that?
I don't know, that's just kind of like just ambling along. Probably finished at some point. I think Springer's, well, they only emailed me once or twice about the status, but that was like 2 years ago now. So I don't seem to be in any hurry. I'm not in any particular hurry. Like one of the main goals of the 3rd edition was just to get permission from O'Reilly to put it, permission from Springer to put it online. And once I got that permission, kind of like lost motivation, because now people can just read it online if they want. I don't know, at some point I'll probably decide to like sit down and grind that out, but no plans at the current time.
Fair enough. How about, do you have any plans down the road for a 3rd edition of Advanced R?
No plans yet. Starting to feel, I mean, I guess like once we get to the point of being able to write a good chapter about S7, that would be a signal. And then the kind of meta programming stuff in Advanced R is a little dated now, in the sense that it's very much about the fundamentals, and we've got these kind of easy to use tools now. But it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't feel too bad to me currently. Like when I don't think of it as like having big holes. There's maybe some, I guess there's a little bit of stuff we've learned about errors that could go in there, but just nothing like, it doesn't feel like it's not, like I don't feel compelled to update it. Yeah,
that's fair. Yeah, I guess S7 makes sense. It's a big piece of what would be new there.
And then I think just like this design, like the design guide just feels like much more important. Like that's still, I think, the missing piece. Like R for data science tells you how to do data science. Advanced R tells you how to write, like how R works. R packages tells you how to write packages, but there's still nothing that really tells you how to like write functions or create good usable interfaces in R. So I think that just feels like the most important thing. And that's those are the sorts of discussions that we have internally with my team that I think would be good to surface that to the wider world.
That absolutely makes sense. So is the design guide your main focus, or just your next focus as far as books go?
I'd say that's my main focus in terms of books. I still haven't like started on it, but I have like not Nice. So like once our packages and r4ds08 are done, I need a little bit of a break, but I will start to get the itchy
And how
fingers
about
again.
yeah? How about outside of books? What are you working on these days?
I've basically been kind of like dropping in on various different Posit packages. So I spent a bunch of time on the RS Connect package, just making that a bit easier to use if we're just using it purely from the command line, and then adding some, like making it so we can use RN but not just packrat, making it easier to share environment variables from your local session to your deployment server. In the future, probably I think we'll want to keep thinking more about like the auth story and how do we make it easier. I think in general, I'd say I've like become more interested in like what are the challenges that you face as a data scientist, like trying to get your job done. And mostly that is no longer like data analysis, I would say. Now it's more like I've done this thing, how do I make sure it runs reliably on my deployment server? So that's like, how do I make sure the auth is correct? How do I make sure the packages are all the package versions are used the same? How do I make sure my code gives good error messages? And when things go wrong, how do I make sure that's like as easy as possible to debug, all that kind of stuff. So working on RS Connect, I've worked a bit on RN as well. So just sort of thinking more about like this wider ecosystem of like, how do you actually like get stuff done as a data scientist, and just kind of see how that goes.
Great. Let's see. These are all kind of related to one another. So when you come across a new package, what is your process for getting to know the package? How do you identify ways to contribute? And how do you get to know the package in general?
Yeah, I would say I've become better at contributing to a package without understanding anything about it or what it does. Just as part of our, our policy of like when we make breaking changes in the tidyverse to go and do pull requests to the packages that are affected. And that means I've kind of gotten better at just like diving in, like finding the exact problem, trying to like change a minimal set of other things. Maybe, sometimes I run tests and it prints out like 400 warnings. And I'm like, okay, well, I have to fix that warning before I can fix the tests. But just trying to figure out the minimal set of changes and sort of like going in there like with my blinkers on and trying not to look at all this other code, which I'm like, why would you do that? Why? My way of getting used to code, like the way I understand code is almost always to like rewrite it or edit it. So like if I really want to get into a package and start using it, I will like start reading the code. Often there's a few things that the package hasn't done in terms of like our latest kind of development guidelines. I'll often just whip through those, update the documentation, switch the test to 3rd edition, just that sort of thing in terms of generating a bunch of like smaller but useful pull requests to kind of assess like, is the package developer interested in this sort of feedback or not? So that's the only way I've ever really figured out how to understand things is to like either rewrite them or write about them.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like one of the ways you get to know something is you write a book about it. So
that's the other way. And then that typically generates a lot of issues and pull requests as well. So.
Yes. So I guess, and related to that, in advanced R, you mentioned that one needs to be well read to improve as an R programmer. Just what outlets do you use or suggest others to use for, I guess, like deciding what to read or becoming well read?
That's a good question, though, and bits of advice are very generic because it's just much easier to say that than to give specific concrete advice. You know, I don't know. I think like understanding the tools you use is always valuable. Like try and dig into the, you know, read the source code of the functions that you use frequently. See if you can understand what's going on. You know, identify. There's almost always little things you can do to improve them, whether it's in the documentation or something else. Like find these like little steps where you can get some kind of easy wins and, you know, make a small, you know, meaningful of small contributions to things. Otherwise reading, yeah, I don't know, there's also, and I also kind of just feel like disconnected now that like Twitter is steadily circling the drain hole, with like where you find that kind of stuff. I don't know, Mastodon is just not the same yet. Don't know if it ever will be. So I think, I don't know, it just feels like there's a kind of a vacuum there at the moment.
Totally agree. So I'm just looking at some of the newer questions that have come in, and I like this, the start of this one. So I love your approach. This is from Simon. Yes. Or they ask, I love your approach to programming, writing lots of shitty code first. And it just moved. Where did it go? There we go. And how do you balance this approach with feeling proud of showing your code?
Yeah, I don't know how I kind of like got to this point where I'm basically kind of like, I feel very little shame in any of the code that I produce. And, you know, some of that is because, you know, I'm a decent programmer, I would say, but it's still like, I don't know, I've been doing, I don't know, still, it also at the same time also surprises me how often I make like the most stupid of mistakes. And I'm like, oh my God, how could you have ever possibly written that code thinking that'll work? When I look at it like 2 days later, it was like, well, what were you thinking, Hadley? So I don't know. I think some of it's just accepting like that everyone feels bad about that stuff. It could always be, everyone's code can be better. Like, I don't know. Yeah, I think some of it's also just like the more you read code, the more like crazy stuff you kind of see, and you're like, wow, that's really a really unique way of expressing that idea. So I don't know. I think you just have to like develop, just like be proud of it. Like, you know, I really like this. I think this is quotes in one of my books, but this, I think it's, I don't know if I can remember it exactly, but from some Zen monk who says like, you're perfect just the way you are, and you could use a little improvement. I think is like the right way to think about your code, and to just not worry about it. And if people judge you poorly for your code, then that's on them. That's not on you.
That is a good philosophy. I like this one. Does Posit have any plans for making R more accessible to non-English audiences? If so, how? For example, making profiles easier, allow multilingual package down sites, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say we don't have anything like concrete planned like right now. That is something I would love us to do more of. You know, I put a bit of time into the PoTools, some contributions to the PoTools package and docs to make that easier. There's like a little bit, a tiny amount in package down, so at least you can like translate the various headings and stuff. I think there's a big question about like what's the best way to like package down sites. I kind of don't think should be multilingual in the sense that you don't want like you shouldn't be doing this in package down. You should be doing this in like the documentation and vignettes. So the question is really like, how do you make multilingual documentation, and how do you make multilingual vignettes, and how do you do that? Like, what's the right framework for doing that so you can easily keep the translations up to date with whatever the main documentation is written in? How do you like advertise that what language each file is written in? How do you make sure people get like the documentation that is closest to what they want? Like how does automated translation play into this all? Like how can we, is it possible to automate like 90% of this and then have smaller team of people just proofreading and making fixes? Is that like more or less rewarding to people? And then I think there's just a lot of like kind of community infrastructure questions, like how do you like find the people and encourage them and help them form a community? How do you make sure the stuff they're providing you is good even when you can't understand the language yourself? I have a lot, many more questions than answers. Love to think about that more. I mean, particularly given the success of like the translations of R for data science, like how can we kind of continue to push those further into the documentation and the kind of the experience of being of doing data science when you're not a native English speaker.
Yeah, it's all an interesting idea. That would be nice to see more. I don't know. I don't have any idea what answers might be, but figuring that out would be great. You touched on AI a little bit, the auto translation and such. Just basically, we had a couple of questions because that's the hot topic these days. The main one was, does Posit have any plans to train a code completion model or integrate any of the open source models like StarCoder into the RStudio AI or IDE? Yeah, IDE. That you can share.
Yeah, that I could share. So the answer to that is like yes. I can't give you I can't give much in the way of details, but we have a bunch of kind of smaller experiments going on in terms of like how can we do better code completion in the IDE? Can we create some like more chat-like interface in the IDE? And like can we or should we be training our own models that's specific to the R community or even like specific to the tidyverse? Nothing that's, I think there's one thing that's in a shape to share publicly, which is, if I can find it, it's chat R. I don't even know. Let's see if I can.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find it somewhere. Okay, I can't find it, but there's a package.
Well,
there is a package. Yeah, there is a package called Cheddar. I don't know if it's on. Edgar Ruiz has been working on it. I mean, it should just.
Okay. Yeah, I will be sure to share that with the video and on R4ds if we track that down. I guess just to start wrapping up, Posit conference is coming up. Do you have any suggestions for first-time attendees? I guess everyone's technically a first-time attendee because it's the first Posit conf, but
yes,
assuming that it's related to RStudio conf, others might not be first time.
What would I say? Yeah, so I think it is like we do our best to make it like a really welcoming and friendly conference. So I think it's great. It is a great way to like meet people. So I'd encourage you to like talk to people. It's something definitely that does not come naturally to me. But everyone at conf is working on in a similar domain. It's a great way to just kind of hear about what interesting stuff people are working on and interested in and struggling with. And then I think, I don't know, the other thing I think is like very, like, don't try and see too many talks. Like it's exhausting, and don't like beat yourself up if you're not, paying attention 100% for 8 hours. Like it's fine to like take breaks, and everything's going to be recorded later. So I think a lot of it for me, the conference is about like, it's a mix of like catching up with people, meeting new people. I'm not capable of paying attention during talks in a conference. So a lot of it for me is like, what are some ideas? Like, just what are these things I want to follow up with after the conference? And I often skip out on talks and have a nap in the afternoon, because being someone who works from home, I can now not survive a day without having a nap. So, yeah, I think that would be my biggest piece of advice. Is like, talk to people and take a nap.
I think that is really good advice for pretty much any conference, that stepping out is okay. You don't have to be on the whole time. All right, and then let's get one more before that. Let's see. There's the R sprint coming up at Warwick in August.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on what people should work on at that?
That is a good question. I think I do. Yeah, I have had thoughts, and I have like shared them with my team members who are going to tell them things that I think they should work on, but nothing that's top of my head right now. I mean, I think the main thing really, again, is just to like, meet people like you, sort of start building a community of folks who can contribute and, support each other along the way.
All right. So we have one from Trevin. Is there a good way to get good at testing? Is there something you just practice at, or is it something that you just practice at, like other parts of code, or are there good resources for it?
I'm sure like all of these things, it can't just be about practice. Like there's got to be some shortcuts, but I do not know what they are. I mean, yeah, I don't know. There's just something about. Yeah, I'd say like I'm at the point where I can say like, I think this is a good test, and I can probably explain why. But I'm not at the point where I can kind of like identify like particularly general principles that you can then like apply to your own code. Because there's some like art to like testing. Like I think a lot of the art of testing is like trying to make sure you're focusing your effort on the things that are most likely to fail, and thinking through like how, while at the same time not making your code too brittle to changes, so that when you do make like a deliberate change, you don't want like half your test suite to fail because it's all testing some like incidental property. So yeah, I don't know. And then I feel like while I've been working on RS Connect and RN, like they just have a bunch of like, it's been interesting working on those packages for me, because they just have a bunch of different kind of constraints, different problems that's forced me to add new stuff to test that, to kind of to work to make it testing easier. And that's sort of starting making me think more about mocking and test state changing stuff. So yeah, I didn't have any very well formed thoughts yet. I think that's another kind of missing. Maybe we'll get into that in the design guide, but it feels like it's a current hole. Like we've got plenty of information about like the mechanics of testing, but not so much about like the philosophy of writing good tests and useful tests, and making the whole thing work. But that is also something I find, like when I go into a new package that's new to me, like I spend a lot of time getting the tests like working more cleanly and faster and more reliably, because without the tests, I mean, I basically, if I don't write a unit test, I'm capable of writing correct code, no matter how simple it is apparently. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a gap. I don't know of any great resources, but something that's kind of in the back of my head a little bit.
I guess to expand on that a little bit, how much do you use like expect snapshot versus something more specific? Okay.
I mean, I think expect snapshot. I mean, I use it a lot for testing error messages, because typically with an error message, you want to check not just that the error occurred, but it actually gives some actionable insight. And the best errors, I think, give you plenty of like context, will give you as much context as possible. And that means in the error message, you're like interweaving code, you know, static text and stuff that the user supplied. And that just needs testing to make sure you're generating like useful sentences. And snapshot tests, I think, have been like transformative for us for that now we are like testing that code, and that forces us, you know, you look at it and then also, you know, it gets reviewed and someone else looks at it. Really, really, really useful.
Okay, great. And I think to close things out, we had a question of, do you have a recommended summer cocktail?
Recommended summer cocktail. What? I'll say like summer cocktails. I really like a mint julep for summer. And rather than using fresh mint, which like since we don't have mint growing in our garden, like goes bad and it seems like 3 days. I like to make a mint simple syrup, which you do by like blanching the mint leaves in boiling water and then putting them in ice, because that like breaks down the enzyme that turns chlorophyll from green to brown, which you want. If you don't want a horrible looking syrup in several days. And then blending it with sugar and water to make a simple syrup. And then like a mint julep is just like bourbon and mint served over crushed ice. And I think that's like a really refreshing cocktail for a hot summer's day.
All right. Well, I think that is a good place for us to wrap up. So thank you very much. If you are catching this on YouTube, come join us at r4ds.io/join. That'll take you to our Slack. And we have many book clubs running, several of them by Hadley and also several other books. So I hope to see everyone there. And again, thank you so much, Hadley.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Great rest of your day.
Bye.